Good evening, everybody. I don't have a name for this potential series yet, but the idea is that I'll be drawing a thing while talking about something that is vaguely related somehow. Today, I'll be drawing bunnies while talking about the 1978 film adaptation of Watership Down. The original author of the book is Richard Adams, and the director for the film adaptation is Martin Rosen. Now, something I want to preface with this real fast is that Richard Adams, in very explicit terms, stressed that the stories he writes are just stories, that there are no hidden messages or meanings within his work. Personally, I think that a work can have higher themes that become naturally instilled as a story progresses, even if it wasn't the intentional choice by the author to do so. So I'm mostly just ignoring Adam's sentiments here. Sorry, Adam. So the art program I am using here today is Krita. I have not used Krita in a hot minute, so I'm very curious to see if I will do very well or if I will just utterly fail. Either way, I hope it'll be somewhat enjoyable for you to watch. So I'm going to do a quick bare bones breakdown of the plot in case you have no idea what Watership Down is about. Spoilers if you don't want me to spoil a film from 1978 to you. Here in 3, 2, 1. Fiver has a vision of his home colony's upcoming demise. He, his brother Hazel, and several other rabbits take an exodus to find a new home. They get through various trials presented by nature, animals, and even other rabbits. Eventually they do find a new home, but oh no, there's no girl rabbits in their rabbit posse. So Hazel and co. try a couple ideas to find some does. Their first attempt is unsuccessful and leaves Hazel wounded for the rest of the movie. Later they try again and successfully recruit does from a rivaling warren. This puts us at our final conflict where the leader of the rivaling colony, Wound Wart, tracks down Hazel's warren and they do battle. And then Hazel wins and the story is over. So with that out of the way, I would like to go ahead and start talking about the film's design choices. So sort of kick off this discussion about design and Watership Down, I'm going to talk about the character design. And I know I said discussion, but technically it's just me talking at you, unless you wanted to leave a comment, which would be totally cool, and I'd appreciate that. Thank you very much. So in this movie, they go for a much more realistic depiction of animals than most animation studios would go. I'm going to get into the design behind the rabbits specifically because that's kind of the focus of the film. The rabbits have eyes on the sides of their head facing outward, which is correct rabbit physiology and holds true to many other prey animals because they benefit from that extended range of vision so that way predators don't catch them off guard. And then the rabbits in this movie are also lean and athletic, which denotes their struggle to survive day to day. And then there are also some rabbits that live a more inactive lifestyle in this movie because they're kept by humans or etc. And they are chubbier, but it's still not like cartoonishly chubby. They look realistic. And the color palettes used in this movie are like very neutral and muted. They use a lot of grays and tans and browns and things like that. And it can actually be kind of tough to tell the rabbits apart for the duration of the film. They all have one or two distinct physical characteristics to help you differentiate them, but that's sort of the caveat of going for a more naturalistic depictions of animals is that you're going to have to find ways to differentiate them. But I think that Watership Down did a pretty good job of that. I think a good way to drive home this point about naturalism versus cartoony proportions in animals, I would like to look at a iconic rabbit in animation history, which would be Thumper from Bambi. If you look at Thumper's face, his eyes are actually forward facing, and he has a really big expressive mouth, big expressive eyes. He also has his iconic foot thump, which is a sort of visual gag in Bambi, whereas in a more naturalistic setting, the vibration from a rabbit thumping his foot is utilized as a warning signal to nearby rabbits that something dangerous is coming. So Disney put a lot of effort into humanizing the appearance and mannerisms of Thumper to make him very relatable to the viewer, so much so that when you look at Thumper, you don't really see a rabbit so much as you see like a human. He's supposed to put you in the mindset of seeing him as a human, which is something that Disney is really good at, especially over time. But really, though, I think that that's why the more realistic style benefits Watership Down so much is because you're not trying to humanize these rabbits. You're trying to get into the headspace of a rabbit and think like a rabbit and feel what a rabbit feels. So I think going for a more realistic style really benefits this story a lot. And also, could you imagine how jarring it would be to have a more cartoony style and Watership Down? Like you have Thumper just merrily hopping along, wherein his brethren are getting brutally savaged by dogs. But yeah, you get the point. As far as the animation in this movie itself goes, it's really good. I mean, I know it's vintage and it's older, very antiquated even, but with the challenges associated with traditional animation at the time, I would go as far as to say that like it's really good. They put a lot of effort into it. It's really, in my opinion, a cut above a lot of their competitors at the time, and I would say that I was even impressed by it at some points. Even revisiting it now that I'm older and more um, critical of things. The backgrounds range visually from these pretty daytime outings to more moody and mysterious. There's a really good balance of variety without it being too much and harming the film's cohesion. I also think the painted backgrounds do a great job conveying a sense of scale between the rabbits and the world they inhabit. Scenes with humans or human environmental elements like cars, houses, sheds all feel really massive, and sometimes it feels like they're made to be oppressive to the rabbits. There's a really good example where the rabbits stop at a cemetery shed and everything feels a touch distorted. And the human tools are all big and large. And then there's a rat attack, and the rabbits are fending off these rats in this spooky old shed. It's a really good scene. It's kind of actiony. Talking more about scenes that visually stuck out to me, it's hard to ignore the scenes depicting graphic violence, but I'm actually not going to talk about that topic just yet. I'll put a pin in it for later. But yeah, I'd say the most striking scene to me was this musical montage around the midpoint in the movie. After Hazel gets wounded by a gunshot and Fiver receives a vision that Hazel is indeed still alive, Fiver sets off on his own and travels through these foggy early morning landscape to find him. And meanwhile this is going on, the song Bright Eyes, sung by Simon Garfunkel, is playing, and it sets the mood perfectly. It was an absolutely ethereal experience for me as a small child watching it for the first time. Another scene I think about a lot when talking about this movie was Fiver's first vision. Near the beginning of the movie, he is out grazing near a field of grass, and while watching that same field of grass, he panics as he realizes it's becoming stained with blood. Which I know that sounds like some silly creepypasta nonsense, but in the film it is executed so well that I can get chills just thinking about it. I feel at this point I should also mention the soundtrack. The orchestral pieces are really good. They fit the mood of the movie very well. I wouldn't say it's like amazing, but I think it is a really good soundtrack, and it's very nostalgic to me. It can kind of like send me back in time when I hear some of the songs and pieces in the soundtrack. And of course, I also think Bright Eyes is just a classic. I really enjoy that song. I was kind of curious the funding this movie received, and it got an estimated 2.4 million. I think that's somewhat above the average for animated films at the time, but also a lot of animated films of the era don't have listed budgets, so I don't guarantee that's what it is, that it's above average. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move along to some descriptors of the characters in this movie. Taking a look at the characters we have here in Watership Down, we start off with our main protagonist, which is Hazel. In the book, I recall he was a sort of straight man to the antics of his fellow rabbits, and over the course of the journey, he goes from a very unassuming character to a very competent leader. And really, he becomes the ideal rabbit in their society's values, which is that he's crafty and wise, and always thinking outside of the box for solutions to their problems. In the movie, he's more of a natural leader who quickly learns to take charge. He sort of doesn't have that arc of going from unassuming regular rabbit to very competent leader. He just is a confident leader. In both versions, he gets wounded by a gunshot and receives a permanent limp as a result, but his value as a leader is so high that his physical handicap doesn't weaken his authority over his warren, which says a lot because normally in those situations, the physical strongest rabbit is the one that sort of takes over the warren and rules it. So, considering that Hazel stays the leader of the group, says a lot about Hazel's ability and the respect that the rabbits have for him. Next, we're looking at Fiver. Fiver is Hazel's brother. He fits into the archetype of a mystic or a prophetic in that he gets visions of things to come, which to counter this sort of really strong skill is that he is physically smaller than the other rabbits. He'd probably be even classified as a runt by the other rabbits. And over the course of the film, the rabbits go from not taking him seriously as a person or his powers to respecting both him and his powers, which is interesting because they did respect his powers in the beginning when they left the doomed Warren, and yet they just ignore all the other instances of Fiverr being like, "This is bad vibes, guys. I don't think we should hang out here," which is kind of funny to me that they were willing to take that leap of faith at first, but not later. I definitely feel like he had more of an arc in the book, but I guess every character would have more of an arc in the book just because the pacing is different and it's harder to fit in full on character arcs in a movie than it is a book. I will say that Fiverr is definitely very relatable as a character to me because he is constantly on edge with like anxiety and existential dread, which I'm sure he's also going to be relatable to all the other Gen Zers and millennials out there. Next, we have Bigwig. Bigwig is the muscle behind the group. He's like a regular bruiser that's not afraid to deal out or take damage. And to complement this, he of course has a temper and a big ego. However, he has like a defining character change moment when he is caught in a snare, and the one who saves him is, of all people, Fiver, who Bigwig really looks down upon for the first quarter of the movie as being like less than because he's physically smaller and also not really taking his powers seriously, just thinking that Fiver is just being overly cautious. So after being saved, he becomes like a much more humble, toned down version of himself. He's a lot more cooperative and laid back. Um, it's actually really enjoyable seeing how he works with the other rabbits and is still, he's still the strongest, but he's definitely come into his own as a more respectable rabbit. These three characters are really are the most well defined of the roster. The rest of their merry band of rabbit folk are not necessarily one note characters, but it really kind of feels like they are. Like you can really boil down their character traits to just a single phrase. They just have a couple defining traits and the film runs with that. So I'll just go through these as fast as I can. Blackberry is book smart. Pipkin is cowardly as well as the youngest. Silver is the strong silent type and he's total bros with Bigwig. Dandelion is the fastest and he also likes to tell stories. Violet's a girl. Holly is calm and he validates Fiver's prophecy at the start of the movie as legit when they encounter him later after he escapes. That was longer than one sentence, but whatever. Later they befriend a seagull named Kya, and Kya is like this goofy jerk that helps the rabbits to repay his debts to them. And then near the end of the film, they also recruit Heisenflay and all her nameless doe friends. Heisenflay is pretty cool, though. She's athletic enough to outpace a large dog and also receives visions much like Fiver, but she experiences a lot more self-doubt about the validity of her own visions than Fiver would, which is kind of an interesting contrast in the two characters. And lastly, they also recruit Blackadder, who is this really bitter and broken down rabbit who's been physically tortured by Woundwart's underlings for attempting to escape their warren previously. He's kind of interesting too. So that's all the sort of like the protagonists and the main cast and side characters. So I'm going to move on to the antagonists. There are a few antagonists in the story, though none of their paths really cross. So I'll just go through them chronologically. First, there's the chief at the start of the film. He ignores Fiverr's vision and sends the Owsla, which is basically a Warren's bunny police force, after the dissenters that follow Fiver and Hazel as they leave. The second antagonist is Cowslip. He's the leader of a colony of rabbits that receive food from humans, but are in return taken and killed by the humans through the systematic use of snares. It's basically a death cult. And Cowslip himself is like a stereotypical sissy villain with a penchant for fatalism. The final antagonist is Woundwort. He is the leader of a warren that is run like a dictatorship, and he is shown to be a very cunning, very strong, and very possessive rabbit. He is not afraid to brutally maul his own rabbits if he smells dissension among them, and also he uses his owlslur to enforce this. But ultimately, his possessive nature proves to be his downfall, as he cannot accept peaceful terms and conditions with Hazel, leading into a final confrontation where he ultimately loses. So I'm going to move along here and talk about a couple things that I didn't like explicitly didn't like, and I think don't necessarily hurt the film, but it definitely dates the film. So the movie and the book more so really commodify female rabbits, as in it becomes a point of conflict in the latter portion of the story. They need does for their warren to exist for more than one generation. It's one of the few things in this story that remind me that this original story was actually written for Adam's sons. Obviously, adults, for whatever reason, refuse to believe little boys can get girl characters. Like several well-rounded female characters enter a storyline, and apparently that'll just destroy little Timmy's suspension of disbelief. He'll just be totally distraught at female representation. And the other thing that I don't like is that the death cult leader Cowslip is very plainly queer coded. Like, what's up with animated films and queer coding villains? I mean, I know why. It's a shorthand to quickly make a character seem deceitful. In the real world at the time, that is what most people thought of non-straights. So, really easy way to warn the audience of a villain in disguise while keeping the rest of the cast uninformed in the film. But I do think both those aspects of the film are kind of unsavory and dated a bit. But I still enjoy the film overall quite a bit. So I just felt like that was something to sort of like a disclaimer to throw out there to let you know. Getting into the overarching themes of Watership Down, the kind of stuff that you would write a book report on in school, you know. I'm going to go ahead and say that I'm not super interested in the political party commentary. Saying that Woundwort and his warren is comparable with the Nazi Party is a connection that I think anybody could come to pretty easily, and they have quite a lot. So I don't really have anything to add to that conversation. So I'm going to move on to bunny religion and mythology. Yes, the religion, believe it or not, is a pretty big component of these characters' journeys. The movie starts out with the creation myth, and the movie ends with Hazel passing on to his bunny afterlife. Religion serves as a sort of foundation for this whole story. When they live their day-to-day lives, the rabbits regularly think of the world in context to having a higher power that is watching over them. I'd go as far as to say that if a new Watership Down story was released within the same canon as this original story, there would be oral traditions and mythologizing of the adventures of Hazel and his friends as part of the rabbit history. Religion in the story somehow manages to be like a callback to how early humans formed their religions and stories as they wandered through the world in tribal communities, which is something that I just find really fascinating how it was able to emulate that. Additionally, I saw some interesting parallels with early Judeo-Christianity. The bunnies believe in a monotheistic god called Firth who created all, and initially everybody is at peace until the bunny forefather El-Re-Ra began producing too many kittens all at once. Those babies ended up taking up too many resources, causing everyone to suffer, and because of this, he was punished accordingly. I feel like that is a very strong parallel to Adam and the creation account of Genesis in the Bible, because Adam was living in a world that was at peace, and then due to eating fruit or whatever, the world became not so great and not so perfect. The way that the account of the story unfolds in Watership Down specifically, as in like Hazel's story, reminds me of the biblical account of Exodus, where Hazel and Fiverr would be taking on the roles of Moses and Aaron as they lead their group to the promised land after fleeing Egypt. Because both stories are full of trials and moments of the followers expressing doubt over the prophecy they are following. And then, of course, death is a constant threat, too. Speaking of death, violence in the narrative of Watership Down is something that the story is really known for. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your lease on life, I got to see this movie before the internet started hyping up the more violent aspects of it. Revisiting the film recently, I still think that it's pretty shocking, but I don't think it's there to just be shocking. It's actually a pretty realistic depiction of the life of a small prey animal, where death is an inevitability that rabbits face in their day-to-day lives. Rosen added a lot to this film by honoring this part of Richard Adams' work. Like, think about it like this. If I paused the movie at the first named character's death, turn to a friend who has never seen the movie before, and ask, "Do you think the rest of them will survive?" My friend would have a hard time answering that confidently. Having death be established as a possible end result for a character's actions or even inactions gave the film a lot more weight. It made stressful situations much more stressful because we know this movie is willing to kill off its characters. And then it makes the payoff for characters succeeding much stronger because we knew that the price of failure could have been death. Really, the sort of issue that a lot of life and death situations have is that I, as an audience member, can usually recognize when a character has plot armor, and therefore I am not worried about that character's safety. However, the early death of Violet and Watership Down breaks the plot armor off a lot of the other named characters because ultimately you can tell, well, the story can continue without them, so there's not really a guarantee that any of these characters are going to survive besides like the main Hazel and Fiverr, or even just maybe one of them. It just really adds a lot to the story knowing that the stakes are there. The stakes are high. You know, if a rabbit screws up, that could be the end of a rabbit's life. It's just a lot more impactful than if it was babyfied, you know? Disneyfied even. So I know that Watership Down is cited as following the hero's journey, but I'm actually not sure if I agree to that, mostly because several steps and archetypes don't really exist in Watership Down's narrative. For example, there's no refusal to call, meaning that our protagonists in Watership Down leave on their journey without experiencing an initial sense of, this is unreasonable, this is crazy, maybe we shouldn't do this at all. Instead, they just go. They're like, okay, bye. Additionally, there is an absence of an older mentor figure who later sacrifices himself to aid the hero halfway through the story. There are portions of the story, especially like the conflicts that Hazel faces, that line up with the hero's journey. Definitely the entire third act, where Woundwort gears up for an all-out assault on Hazel's Warren, and then the final fight that occurs between them, and then Hazel winning and transcending to the Rabbit Hall of Fame, all perfectly line up with like the final three steps of the hero's journey. That I will definitely agree on. So I definitely get why it gets said that this story follows the hero's journey, but I do think that it is missing a couple steps. So I think that actually has some interesting commentary behind it, wherein that a story, because obviously Richard Adams, when he wrote this, he said he didn't have any outside references or influences. He was just writing stories. He didn't base it on anything. So I think it kind of is a testament to just how inclusive the hero's journey is, how malleable, and how it can be applied to anything without even trying to. Because I feel like that's definitely what happened here, you know? Because a lot of the tropes in the hero's journey are just things that are instinctual for humans when they're writing stories. On a note to end on for this sort of thematic discussion, I just really like how the story manages to emulate the oral storytelling traditions of early human societies. It's rabbit folklore told in manners alike to how humans told human folklore by the fireside many years ago. And I think that there's something intrinsically beautiful to that. that a lot of stories over the years have just never really managed to capture because it's just really not something anyone thinks about. And because of that, I just have so much respect for this work of art, really. I would consider it art. It's not my favorite story ever for sure, but I definitely think that it's a story that will go down as a classic and will never really grow old, in my opinion. I feel like it really does sort of remind me of like an epic or something of that nature. And I think that its place is really well deserved in the history of literature, and I like it a lot, and I recommend it. All right.